Hello and welcome to What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin, joining you for episode 9, our first episode for 2025. We are now a quarter of a century into this new millennium. It's Friday, January 3, and today I'm joined by Laetitia van den Assum, a former Dutch ambassador who was first posted to Southeast Asia in 1995 when she was accredited as ambassador to Myanmar from Bangkok. Laetitia also served as a member of the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State, established in August 2016. Hello, Laetitia.
Hello, what a pleasure to be here.
And a pleasure to have you. Before we launch into our discussion, let's, as usual, run through a quick news digest on the podcast, this time from the past 2 weeks. The State Administration Council, the SAC, has enacted its cybersecurity law, effectively banning virtual private networks, or VPNs, and requiring internet service providers to collect user data and provide it to the regime, no questions asked. While the new law is obviously oppressive, regime police and soldiers have already, for nearly 4 years since the coup, detained and brutalized civilians for internet content and VPNs found on their phones, at checkpoints and in interrogation centers. The SAC also last week amended the motion picture law, solidifying industry restrictions and increasing penalties for avoiding pre-exhibition censorship. The military has slowly tightened the rules since the coup, and especially since last year. Now the amended law also prohibits Myanmar artists from showing their films abroad without censorship board approval. Given most people in Myanmar consume video content via mobile devices and on their home screens, even with electricity outages and internet restrictions, censorship is unlikely to constrain people's media consumption as it did in the period before 2012. But the amended law does throttle the creativity of the industry within military-ruled parts of the country. And regarding those parts, the SAC published provisional results of its compromised census attempt from October last year, this Tuesday. The numbers published were created mostly by recourse to dubious population estimates, as the military only conducted the census in areas it felt secure, less than half of the country's townships. And as published by Frontier at the time, its questions were intrusive, against best practice, and enumerators were often compelled into service. All of this providing pretty strong disincentives for the people being questioned to give true answers and provide accurate data. Either way, more data from the census is supposed to be published throughout this year. And the military's State Administration Council has blocked the public from ascending Mount Popa, a renowned spiritual and cultural site in Jalpadaon, after a resistance group killed 2 soldiers there on December 27. Attacks at this famous landmark, and others like it, attract more attention from the public, and closing them down interferes with the military's attempt to project whatever limited sense of normalcy it can in the areas it controls. It also severely affects the livelihoods of local people who rely on selling to visitors to these areas. To the west of that volcanic peak, the Chin Brotherhood has consolidated its control of Mindat and Kampalet towns, taking the latter without a shot fired. The Brotherhood was aided by resistance groups from Mugwe and Sagayan regions to the east, and the Myanmar military's on-the-ground presence in Chin State now looks more tenuous than ever in 2025, with resistance groups controlling over a dozen major towns in a state with few paved roads. The military's airstrikes, though, continue to target civilians and infrastructure, and most of the resistance-controlled town populations remain displaced. The Chin Brotherhood stated that Falam, depopulated and increasingly affected by conflict, is their next objective. Further south, the Arakan Army has now taken control of Gua Township, which hosts the southernmost paved mountain road out of the state to the Irrawaddy Delta, the dry zone, and to Yangon beyond. It also abuts a heavily forested corner of Irrawaddy region that leads to the famous resort beach of Jampa and the large city of Patain, where the Southwestern Regional Military Command is based. The Arakan Army claims over 700 Myanmar military soldiers were killed in the Gwa offensives, including a light infantry division commander. And after months of multiple military successes, the Arakan Army has released a statement saying it's open to political dialogue with the SAC and reassuring all that it will recognise and protect the foreign investments in Rakhine State that it now surrounds. However, the group's offensive do continue, and they're clearing out the few remaining military camps in the state to no public response from the Myanmar military. Alongside this absence, rumours are spreading that hundreds of Chinese security contractors have arrived in Jalpu and are setting up electronic security platforms like CCTV and wireless jammers. And amid further reports that Bangladesh has started informally reaching out to the Arakan Army, our guest Laetitia van den Assum published an opinion piece in Frontier this week discussing the Bangladesh interim government's success at having the UN General Assembly adopt a resolution calling for a high-level conference on the Rohingya refugee crisis, scheduled for later this year. Laetitia was part of the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State that ran from September 2016 to August 2017 and produced a report towards a peaceful, fair and prosperous future for the people of Rakhine. The commission was not the first of its type, but it was the first to be independent, and it was set up at the behest of then State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi. It was a national entity. It had 6 Myanmar members and 3 international members, of which Laetitia was one. As some listeners will recall, that very same day, just a few hours after the commission concluded and released its recommendations, Rohingya militants expanded their limited attacks on police and army bases in northern Rakhine State. The Myanmar military quickly unleashed an exhaustive campaign of atrocities against Rohingya civilians, pushing hundreds of thousands of already stateless people from their country of birth. Most survivors ended up in refugee camps in Bangladesh, and this is where most of them remain today. Many ethnic Rakhine civilians also joined the army in its collective punishment of Rohingya communities at the time. Laetitia, I would love for you to first reflect a bit on the Commission and your work understanding the crisis in Rakhine State. That's because in your new opinion piece, you write that many of the Commission's 2017 recommendations actually remain relevant today. So what was your role exactly in the Commission, and how do you look back at the report from a 2025 perspective when Rakhine State has changed so much but also so little?
Thanks very much, Luke. Thanks for having me. The report of the Rakhine Advisory Commission of 2017 does remain very relevant. We spoke with over 1,100 different people and groups in Rakhine State and in other parts of the country. And it was very clear that we saw ourselves, and our terms of reference indicated that we were an independent commission. Now, an independent commission was not something that Myanmar had a great deal of experience with. I think our report on Rakhine State was the 7th, and the first one that was independent. And many of the others were shelved and nothing ever happened with them. So probably the understanding, certainly also on the part of Myanmar's military, was that fine, this would be quite similar. We would do a draft report and they would be allowed to comment on it, and that it would be changed to their liking. That did not happen. The reason why it is still so relevant is because we deliberately did not write a very long and detailed report. We did have 88 recommendations, which sounds like a lot, but they were fairly open-ended. And why was that? Because we felt that a lot of things might happen after we left, and the important thing was to make a contribution that the people in Rakhine State and their government and others could continue to use as sort of a living document. You adjust and you change, and you the situation changes, etc. Because some things have changed. We focus on 3 main crises: the crisis of security, or insecurity rather, the crisis of development, and a crisis of human rights. Now, in terms of the crisis of development and the crisis of human rights, not much has changed. I mean, it certainly hasn't gotten better, but it's still highly relevant. What has changed, of course, is the security situation. The Arakan Army in Rakhine State in control of between 90 and 100% of the land, which is a formidable achievement, something that no one had expected. But many of the recommendations that we wrote about security forces and what their role was and how they should be, for example, under control of a civilian entity, are still highly relevant. So on the whole, it is, because it is a living document, it is one that should be picked up, be discussed, and by the people of Rakhine State themselves to decide what is relevant for them at this particular point in time, with particular focus, of course, on maintaining the important principle that is there, is equality before the law, and which, of course, is not the case right now, and was certainly also not the case when we arrived there.
Thank you. Thanks. And regarding exactly that, the equality before the law, what's your opinion on how the Arakan Army, or the AA, has treated Rohingya civilians so far in their struggle to rule Rakhine State, but in particular the last 2 years when they've had these rapid territorial gains?
I think it's fair to say that, say, about 2 years ago, we were getting a lot of signals in parts of central Rakhine. The situation was getting better. Freedom of movement was better than in the north. For example, access to education has certainly improved. We saw in 2022, I think some 20 or 22 Rohingya, for the first time since 2012, being admitted to Sitwe University, which was really great progress that was being made, and it sent positive signals. What we're looking at now, however, is, let me call it, considerable confusion, because we do not have much information about what is happening in Rakhine State, or has been happening, say, especially during 2024. Although the military government from Naypyidaw will probably lose the war, it did win an important battle, and that is the battle that led ultimately to their further sowing of division between the Rakhine and the Rohingya and all the other minorities that are there, because it's not only Rakhine and Rohingya, there's many others. And that they very successfully did. And, the story about a lot of this still has to be told, what exactly happened. We've seen, of course, a lot of assertions from various sides about what happened, particularly in Buttidaung and in Mangdaung. I think that what's really needed, and I think I said it in the op-ed as well, is an independent assessment, because without an independent assessment, it may be difficult for reconciliation to really come to fruit, because that is what is needed. The problem also was, of course, that with the figure that Reuters has mentioned of between 3,000 and 5,000 Rohingya being taken from Bangladesh back to Rakhine State to work mostly for the Sitat, contributed considerably to the fog of war, because there really was and is fog of war there as a major factor. We do not know exactly what happened. That part, what happened, say, particularly between, say, from March to towards the end of this year, is a major tragedy, and ways have to be found to overcome that. And overcome that is the key to greater collaboration between all communities towards a future for all of them working together. And there is a lot of work to be done by everyone, because Rakhine State is in tatters. Look at the roads, look at the bridges, look at the basic infrastructure, the landmines everywhere, the inability to make sure that farmers are able to farm, to deliver food to the entire state, are other serious threats. So it's in the interest of all communities trying to find ways to reconcile is really critical.
I wonder, can the Rohingya militant organizations play a constructive role in that process? I'm thinking like the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, the Rohingya Solidarity Organization. These groups kind of appear, disappear, and they've morphed and shifted alliances right throughout the Rakhine State conflict. You also mention in your op-ed piece that Bangladesh authorities must have been involved in facilitating getting these thousands of Rohingya from the refugee camps in Bangladesh back into Myanmar to fight against the AA in recent months.
Well, it's a good question, and it's very relevant right now because, the Myanmar military is gone from northern Rakhine State, as far as we know, and what is left there are the Rohingya militias. Again, it's difficult to get accurate information, but it looks like these militias are still being armed, are still able to attract new recruits from the camps in Bangladesh. So, it has to come from both sides. And it's also important for perhaps Bangladesh to ask itself how they can help bring about an end to this terrible fighting, which doesn't serve anyone. It doesn't serve the militias, it doesn't serve the AA, and it doesn't serve the government of Bangladesh to continue the fighting and the killing of so many people totally unnecessarily. And I know that discussions are already taking place, but I don't really know quite in which direction they're going.
Okay, so that Bangladesh side, talking about that more broadly, as you mentioned, they've put up this new conference. I wanted to ask you about that. You're a former ambassador and diplomat. You're familiar with international organizations. So could you describe what a so-called high-level conference kind of looks like? In general terms, or particularly, like how are these things chaired and organized? Do they end with a joint statement? What can we expect?
I think it's good that there is an effort being made to get a conference together. For the moment, it still looks, even though everyone finds it important, it's still looking for clear objectives. It started out, that is part of a UN General Assembly resolution, as a conference about the Rohingya more generally. We here in Bangladesh, of course, was the initiator. You mentioned that. Within Bangladesh, the discussion now seems to be focusing more on the Rohingya in Bangladesh alone. I think clearly, that is important because there are big issues there. I mean, certainly after 8 years, since 2017, when that big wave of Rohingya came across, it's time that this is addressed more generally. And the good thing is that there are changes in Rakhine State, that the AA and its civilian arm, the United League of Arakan, have signaled that they're prepared to talk about this, to get them together. But there is a much bigger issue that I think needs to be. It's not only about Bangladesh. There are 2.8 million Rohingya around the world. About 1.1 million are in Bangladesh. So it's the biggest group. So it deserves a lot of attention. But there are, as we speak, boats going across the high seas under very dangerous, treacherous circumstances with Rohingya from both Rakhine and from Bangladesh, seeking to go to Malaysia, to Indonesia. In some countries like Saudi Arabia, like Pakistan, there are large numbers of Rohingya. It's important that under the guidance of the UN, the bigger picture of the Rohingya situation in various parts of the world is looked at, and then and to come up with tailor-made solutions for the different groups. Because to name one example, one of the biggest groups of Rohingya is in Saudi Arabia, but they have been there for decades, and I think many of them have never actually ever been to Rakhine. They have no active links with it anymore. And so it would be up to the international community to help everyone look at, okay, what might be tailor-made solutions. If you look at those who left more than 20 years ago and spent all that time in exile and don't have an active link with Arakan, only 28% 8% of them feel that they would still like to return. If you look at the newly arrived, so if you look at those in Bangladesh and those in Indonesia, which is a very recent addition, for example, 76% want to return. So you have to look at what it is that the Rohingya themselves want, and you have to ask the countries in which these Rohingya are now living, how would they want to see the next generation of Rohingya in their countries? How would you like to see them growing up in their society? As, productive tax-paying members, or as people begging in the shadows of society? This is not only about about Bangladesh and Rakhine. This is about a much bigger problem that needs to be addressed once and for all in its entirety.
Yes, it's not just about Bangladesh, as you say. Taking that a little bit further, like sticking with the conference procedurally, it's also crucially, this conference on the Rohingya is also about Myanmar, and anything UN related quickly gets complicated when it comes to Myanmar. So what would Bangladesh see as successful? What do you think they would want in that space? Like, would Jormo Tun, still Myanmar's UN ambassador, be at the conference representing the National Unity Government? Would the military be there, or China even? How would that play out?
It's difficult to see what will happen. I think we are now going through some very complicated months. And this year, 2025, is going to probably determine a lot of questions that we still have now. But the uncertainty is very high, and you see amongst the international community, particularly the neighbors of Myanmar, you see growing anxiety about instability as posing direct risks to them. And the international community, and particularly talking about the immediate neighbors, but also about others in ASEAN, they seem to be becoming much more active now. There are growing refugee flows, there's the halting of trade and investment, there is the humanitarian fallout, and in general, more general, the growing insecurity. But it's not clear where the thinking of all of these different countries and actors is going. There was a recent conference in Bangkok just about 2 weeks ago, which showed that even amongst that particular group, the ASEAN plus the neighbors of Myanmar, it was impossible to get clear view to the road ahead of where things should go. And that is an appeal to the wider region is important to make sure that in their discussions, they do not only look at their own worries about instability, refugee flows, and the halting of trade. They should include much more the thoughts and the considerations that many in Myanmar have already been giving to this. And you mentioned the NUG, the National Unity Government, the ethnic armed organizations, and others are stakeholders. They control more than 50% of the country, probably more than 60% of the country. Why are those countries, which is important players in the international community, not listening to them more? That is really a big question. It's not that these other stakeholders, let me call them that, are not willing to sit down and discuss. They are prepared, but they have, some of them, I think most of them share this feeling, made conditions. They do not want to sit at the same table with the Myanmar military, which is responsible for the enormous trauma and resentment. To them, it's inconceivable that is possible. But they're willing to talk with others, and on the condition, of course, that the Constitution of 2008, that has to go off the table, that there has to be a new constitution. They have done work. Work is ongoing as we speak on what the way forward would be. But it's difficult because perhaps this goes a bit far, but it's like being back in 1948, when it was clear that all of these different groups had different aspirations and have been given different expectations by the Brits and by others. And ultimately, that led, of course, in 1962 to the military taking full control and suppressing all of the ethnic minorities, to not take account at all of the differences between people, but trying to put all of them in the same mode. And it hasn't worked. That we're still dealing with the same problem, but what it means is that what has been lacking all of those years, the debate, the serious discussions, open discussions, participation by everyone, which is going to be very slow process. Time has to be taken for that to take place. It's not going to change overnight. And if that kind of process is not allowed to take place and is not supported positively, constructively by the international community, the future for Myanmar would look very bleak.
That is true, and thank you for going wider there. But now I want to bring it back to Rakhine State and think about, this military. A precondition for any improvement in Arakan at all surely requires the military to refrain from airstrikes, in this crucial year. The AA now controls the land and the rivers, but the Myanmar military controls the skies and largely the coast. So if the army bombs the state heavily, then the AA could expand operations to the capital, Sittwe, to Irrawaddy region, and, to probably stay focused on combat over governance and rebuilding the state. But on the other side, the Chinese investments in Rakhine State could dissuade military leaders from unleashing the Air Force's wanton destruction, and maybe some kind of political settlement between the AA and the military could occur. What do you think about that assessment?
I think, let's be honest. The international community has a big role to play in this. But what we're seeing over the past couple of months is the international community going backwards and not thinking constructively, but being terribly worried about what is happening. And that the talk of the collapse, the black hole in the middle of South Asia, it's basically about the loss of control. And what the international community, not everyone, but the ones that I mentioned, the neighbors and ASEAN, seem to be prepared to do is find ways to keep propping up the military. And certainly China has demonstrated that that's what its intention is. It's not possible. It's simply not possible that the situation will return to control by the military. In the case of China, not of the others, in the case of China, what you see, I think, is also the fear that the National Unity Government and the ethnic armed organizations of others have contacts with what these governments see as, particularly China sees as Western governments, Western agencies. And I don't think that is the case. I mean, they've done this themselves. So there is no going back, and the international community has to become part of the solution and not become part of the problem. You have to look at what the Arakan Army has been and the ULA have been saying over, say, the past year, and before that. They have always voiced a willingness to find a way for an inclusive Arakan, as they call it, an inclusive Rakhine State, where there is space and there are roles for everyone. I think they would do well to table their views on how they want to achieve that. They've been very general. But now comes the time when you have to look at, okay, we've gone through this terrible trauma on all sides. I don't want to go further back than the Second World War, but everyone has been traumatized. And no doubt the Rohingya have been traumatized and much worse than the others, but everyone is a victim. How do you unite them? How do you bring them together? There needs to be accountability. There needs to be a plan put forward for transitional justice. But I think also what everyone has to realize is that, Rakhine State lies in tatters. It needs to be repaired. It's very easy to say, okay, now from tomorrow we will give everyone a freedom of movement. That's perhaps not realistic. You have to do that slowly, deliberately, listening to everyone's fears, because they have been taught from when they were small children that these other communities are your enemies. That is deeply ingrained. And I think that putting together a representative group of people from Rakhine State to discuss these kinds of things, and who would also be able to interact with the international community about possible support for the massive training that needs to take place. Just think of the Chinese investments alone there. There are going to be many opportunities. One thing that is mentioned in the Annan report also is, do a survey of the kind of labor needs, vocational training. Will you have to accept that, Chinese are brought from China to do all the work, or is this going to be a massive, huge positive challenge for people from all communities to be brought together, to be trained, and to be part of the rebuilding of Arakan? These are just some very practical things, but I think it's important for the Arakan Army to make a gesture and to start to talk about how it wants to move forward. And of course, it's been doing quite a number of things, particularly in the center of Rakhine State, where you have these judiciary mechanisms, where you have these local civilian government structures that have been set up. They can perhaps be a good basis for further development of the overall system of governments that's up to them to decide. But the olive branch also that we need from the Arakan Army towards the Rohingya, particularly those that are still in Bangladesh, that you welcome. And we may not be able to accept all of you immediately, but we'll make a plan for all of you to come back, for those who want to come back, that is. And what's really important is that people in Bangladesh also understand that Rakhine State is broken, that if you cannot build a 1 million strong refugee camp on the other side of the border, where people will just live the same lives, go from one refugee camp to another. It's in the interest of Bangladesh and others to make sure that that goes gradually, carefully, in consultation, that border security is guaranteed, and that the people who do go back there to areas where they can actually fend for themselves. So there are a lot of discussions that need to take place. I'm optimistic that the willingness is there, but we have to expect that this is going to take a lot of time and quite a lot of resources from the international community as well.
Well, thank you so much, Laetitia. You are our only guest today, and I really appreciate you giving us so much time. I guess the main takeaway is international involvement and recognition of the Arakan Army's de facto control of the state. And if anyone wants to read the full op-ed published by Laetitia, just check the show notes below this episode. This is also the right time to address you, the listener, and remind you that if you are not already, you can become a member of Frontier Myanmar for as little as $8 a month, and you'll receive regular updates to your email inbox and invitations to private events, the daily briefing, media monitor, and the political insider. Just go to frontiermyanmar.net to check out all those options. All right, thank you so much, Laetitia. Until we have you on the show next time, goodbye.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. These are all issues that are close to my heart.
Indeed, and that really comes through. Now, this podcast is back to its regular schedule, so the next episode is going to be published on Saturday, January 11. Until that time, farewell and take care.